We love to celebrate Darwin because he has his accomplishments in all of his writing, but not just that he discovered these things, because other people discovered those things, and that work would have been published by someone else eventually. But he was such a clear thinker, and if you've read his books, and you should. If you have not read his books, you should. If you have read his books, you'll know that it was his clarity of thought and his gracious manner of writing that drew people in, and anybody could understand his work. And he had to convince himself of the truths he found, and he does it in such a humble way that other people can't help but understand quite a bit about evolution by reading even any of his earlier books. And he was just astounding for so many reasons, and we sort of like to celebrate his day, his birthday, because he was sort of an icon. He was a harbinger of the oncoming and ever rapidly increasing onslaught of science and scientific method. And there's probably nobody in Kelowna that knows more about Darwin than our first speaker. I'm probably safe to say that. He has been a long-time friend and colleague of mine, decades now. We have to admit, it's been decades. And his name is Dr. James Hull. I'll stop saying he. He's quite well known around campus for his wit, his humor, his unique personality, and his hair, yeah, which is it never seems to grow or get shorter. You never cut it, or I don't know how it stays the same, and the beard and everything. He, don't tilt on this stupid iPad. I better make sure he is an associate professor of history, I knew that. And he teaches courses in the history of science. He knows a lot about the history of the methodology of science. And he has a BA and an MA. I've been really sick, by the way, so I'm just recovering and I can't talk right yet. He has a BA and an MA from the University of Toronto and a PhD from York. He is an affiliate of the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology. He's editor-in-chief of the oh-so-coolly named Scientia Canadensis, which is the journal of the Canadian Science and Technology Historical Association. I said that all in one piece. He's also co-editor of Science, Technology, and Medicine in Canada's Past. Did I get that right? Awesome. And he's pretty much a cool guy. So let's welcome James Hull to give our first talk.
Thank you so very much, Blair. I mentioned my first degree actually was a BSc, not a BA. I'm an oddity as an
Oh,
historian.
I keep trying to think you were a scientist. I'm sorry.
I don't know, some scientists mock age.
I just keep trying.
Thank you all very much for coming out this afternoon. That was a good start. Click on the board. That works somehow. This guy's not very well remembered now. In his time, which was Darwin's time, he was one of the outstanding figures in the biological sciences in England. He's somewhat notorious for the fact that in 1859, he reflected back on the events of the previous year in his science and regretted that nothing really very important had happened that year, which is rather remarkable, since one of the things that happened is that he himself chaired the meeting at which Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was introduced to the world. Many of us would retrospectively identify that as a fairly significant thing that had happened in the year 1858. Now, the next year, 1859, the year, the event, the publication of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. That one, nobody could have missed the significance of. Indeed, the significance of it reverberates indeed to our present day. We're here now, not because Darwin was born 200 and a little bit years ago, but because this was published 150 and a little bit years ago. With the publication of The Origin of Species, it can be safely said that it became impossible to view the natural world the way it had been viewed prior to the publication of that book. And that's an extraordinary thing to say about any publication. Before The Origin, the view of nature which most people in Western society had was that living things in their current form exhibited the intentions of he who had created them in that form. After this book, it was understood that living things in their current form were the outcomes of a natural process. That is an extraordinary change. What should we make of it? Well, the first thing to know is that everyone who read Darwin's book, including Darwin himself, was quite familiar with another book. This one, here, the bottom. Darwin knew that. Darwin knew that his audience, like himself, was very familiar with that book. In our day, where few have read right through either of those books, and very, very few have read right through both of those books, there is a tendency to want to see those books as having been from the start and purposefully for Darwin in opposition, and to in a sense, take modern statements of Darwin versus the Bible, or evolution versus Genesis, or whatever, and project that back into Darwin's day. And I'm sure we've all seen these things on the backs of cars. Right? Your car had one of those as well, rather a puckish reply to the Christian fish symbol. The Darwin indeed has, in this sense, literally become an icon of some sort of opposition between science and religion. As an historian, I actually think that's rather unfortunate because it very quickly leads us into some pretty serious misunderstandings of what the historical moment was in which Darwin did what he did, and how people at that historical moment would have understood what he did. It leads us into, indeed, I could go further, some pretty serious misunderstandings of the whole history of science and religion, and that generally, and what Darwin did particularly. Just to begin with, no, Darwin was not setting out with the intention of replacing the biblical account of creation in Genesis with his, Darwin's, own scientific account. Darwin was engaged in a scientific debate about how living things change. He was not entering or offering to enter into a theological debate. So, what was he doing? To explain that, and I will just share with you my own understanding of what was going on historically. That's what I do as a historian. We imagine the past, and we invite others to imagine along with us what the past was all about. I hope will help us to understand what we might call the Darwin incident more correctly. To do that, I need to explain what was going on, what had gone on in science, especially as scientific understanding related to religious understanding. And on the basis of that, having cleared that ground, then I want to talk to you not terribly much about what Darwin's argument was and what evolution is all about, because there is an infinitely more qualified speaker who later this afternoon will tell us about what evolution is all about. Rather, I want to talk about why Darwin made his argument the way in which he made his argument. That addressing as he was and as he knew he was, people who shared in his time a particular understanding of God and nature. And then I will briefly talk about what the outcome of that was in Darwin's own day and a little bit afterwards. I'm going to talk about the context in which Darwin did what he did, a little bit about the content of his argument, especially the form of it, and then a very little bit about the consequences. No one objects so far? Proposals of how they burned at the stake yet? Right. Okay. All right. The notion, and this is something that every year, in just about every course I teach, I tell my students, the idea that the history of science has been a history of war between science and religion is an idea that was actually made up in the 19th century. A rather bad idea. Can we find examples from history of clashes between scientists conducting science on the one hand and religious authorities unhappy about that on the other hand? Yeah, sure we can. We can also find examples of people deliberately flying airliners into skyscrapers. The results are extremely dramatic, but those incidents don't actually tell us very much about the relationship between airplanes and skyscrapers, which is not what the normal relationship is between those two. They normally, in fact, don't have a great deal to do with each other. Normally, science and religion, in fact, have not historically had a great deal to do with each other. Most of the time, they've in fact had no points of contact at all. In the Western tradition, it was long established before Darwin's time that while God could intervene in his created world anytime he feels like, hey, he's God, right? That most of the time he doesn't actually do that. And thus, a rational science offering naturalistic explanations of natural phenomena is perfectly possible. That science, the technical expression was that science, it was understood right up to Darwin's time, was the study of secondary causes. What does secondary causes mean? Secondary causes means roughly this. Why is there a solar eclipse? Well, the primary cause of why is there a solar eclipse is that's the way God made the universe. Okay? But the secondary cause of why is there a solar eclipse is that the disk of the moon gets interposed between the sun and observers on the Earth, thereby occluding the sun. We get a solar eclipse. That is what science deals with. Explanations of that sort is what science deals with, and one can discuss those explanations without, in fact, having anything to say one way or the other about God, and that normally is, in fact, what science did. We're talking about astronomical bodies. Copernicus, right, comes along, he, as it was said, sets the Earth in motion around the Sun. We know about, consequentially, Galileo's problems with the Church, which are at least as poorly understood popularly as the whole Darwin incident is. I could easily lecture on that, I'm not going to. What people, though, coming out of the scientific revolution and in the wake of the Galileo trial get their heads around is in a phrase that is incorrectly attributed to Galileo, he didn't make it up, that astronomy, it does its thing, the Bible does its thing, and that the Bible, and this is the famous phrase, the Bible tells us not how the heavens go, but how to go to heaven. In other words, coming out of the scientific revolution of early modern times, people have gotten their heads around the idea that the Bible is not an astronomical textbook. Indeed, Copernicus himself, and for 60 years after Copernicus, nobody had any trouble with what he had said. By the 19th century, people got their heads around the idea that just as the Bible was not an astronomical textbook, no, neither was the Bible a textbook of geology. That the person, probably more than anyone else, who helped with that was this guy here, Charles Lyell, someone who was, by Darwin's own testimony, one of the two most profound influences on him, Darwin. Charles Lyell created the dominant geological paradigm of Darwin's time. Darwin said, indeed, if you don't believe Lyell, don't bother reading me, because you're not going to believe me either. That Lyell had made it clear, and largely this is what people bought into, that the Earth, the way the Earth looks now is a result of a very, 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 very long natural process. Indeed, that natural process continues to go on. How old is the Earth? He didn't say, nobody else had a very good idea of it, but under this scientific understanding, which was the shared scientific understanding well established by Darwin's time, the Earth was not infinitely old, but indefinitely old. It was extremely old. It was as old, in fact, as it needed to be for all of these scientific things, scientifically estimable things, to have gone on. And it is indeed with that understanding of the age of the Earth that Darwin addresses his audience, an audience that had gotten their heads around this idea that that's how old the Earth was, right? Darwin's not, in fact, talking to people who think the Earth is 6,000 years old. That's not on the agenda. No, he's talking to an audience of people who understand their geology on the basis of what's called uniformitarian geology that supposes the Earth to be indefinitely old. Darwin, here he is as a young guy, here this is Darwin, around the time that he would have been on the Beagle. Darwin would help to make the point that just as the Bible is not an astronomy textbook, just as the Bible is not a geology textbook, so too the Bible is not a biology textbook. And indeed, as he's sending off the manuscript of his book to the publisher, he's saying about these words that what I'm writing doesn't fly in the face of Genesis any more than any introductory survey geology text of my day does. So why is anybody going to be excited about this? By Darwin's time, by the time that The Origin of Species was penned and published, that the world in the past had been very different from the world in the present, was well established. The nature of the fossil record was well understood. The notion that God seeded the fossil record with false evidence to fool us was a non-starter right from the beginning. That attracted the attention of no serious person. The assumption was that there were limitless drafts of time for natural processes to work in. That human history would in fact partake in those limitless drafts of time was something that was just being recognized at the time that Darwin was publishing The Origin of Species. Did what was going on in science pose any particular challenges for religion? Were there any people who were drawing conclusions from scientific understanding by Darwin's time contrary to prevailing religious ideas? Sure they were, though. They were actually relatively obscure people. The German physicist Ludwig Buchner, writing in 1855, so that's 4 years before The Origin of Species comes out, drawing not upon anything in geology, not upon anything in biology, but drawing upon physics, says, look, it's well established by the physicists, everything can be explained in material terms, that we've no more any need of believing in God. But he was just seen as weird. That's not very influential, in fact. That's the scientific context. The other part, though, of the context for what Darwin does, that is just as important, is the context of what is called natural theology. It sort of sounds like an oxymoron because theology is supernatural and unnatural, right? But the term natural theology, a very, very well established one, natural theology as an intellectual tradition also comes out of the scientific revolution. It goes back to most notably Francis Bacon, the person who most strongly argued for the empirical, the inductive, the let's get our facts and build up our theories from facts part of scientific methodology. He is the one who said that you may read about God in one of two books, the Bible being one of them, that's God's word. The other is the book of nature, God's created world. Indeed, that idea that we may go look at the natural world, and because God had created it, that we may study the details, we may be awed by the details, that's A-W-E-D, awed, not O-D-D, awed, by the details of nature. But we may thus get some idea, possibly what was God in God's mind when he created the world. That natural theology was a dominant intellectual tradition, certainly in the English-speaking world, at Darwin's time. That, in fact, not people thought the Earth was 6,000 years old, forget that. That, the natural theology thing, that was a big deal. That is what Darwin has to address, because every last person who picks up and reads his book thought that. William Paley is the great name in natural theology. He gave what is probably the best explication of natural theology, and in his writings he gives what is always cited as the classic, almost literally the textbook example of how this works. It's Paley's metaphor of the watch, which roughly speaking, probably many of you are familiar with it here, but I'm going to return to it, so let me say it to make sure everybody knows it. Roughly goes like this. Paley said, look, you're out for a walk, you look down the ground, you see this object, you pick it up and you examine, it's a watch you found, you examine it, you look at all of its intricate workings, you figure out what it's doing, it's a time piece. Well, could you suppose that just by some freakish accident, all of its various parts assembled themselves into something that would keep time? No intelligent person could think that. That's stupid. Rather, clearly, if there is a watch, there was a watchmaker. That the design of this watch tells us that there was a designer. We look at the world, we look at the infinitely greater complexity and wonderfulness of the world, we see design, there must have been an infinitely greater designer. This is one of the classic proofs of the existence of God by evidence from design. After Paley, but before Darwin, there was a series of books commissioned and published in Britain called the Bridgewater Treatises, which argued the natural theology position, argued that position not contrary to science, but in fact argued it largely as a pro-science position. That is the immediate and most important intellectual context for Darwin. the people who he must convince that he is right are the people who believe that. If he cannot convince those people, it's, go sail back to the Galapagos, because it's not going to work. Huh? Okay. Well, how does he do it? Not by telling all the natural theology people, you're wrong. Rather, by presenting an argument which, in important respects, sounds like a natural theology argument, even as he in fact subverts it. By tipping his hat right off the bat to the big names of that tradition, by appealing to evidence in exactly the same way that people who talk about natural theology appeal to evidence, by picking no quarrel with God that he doesn't have to pick. And indeed, I'm going to argue to you, maybe even by enlisting God on his side. I very much doubt that you can read that there. This is what appears right at the front of The Origin of Species. Even before you start reading it, you get these three quotations here. So this is what Darwin wants to do in the way of running up his flag before you start reading his book. He's got these three quotations. One from William Whewell, one of the authors of one of those Bridgewater treatises that I spoke about, the person who is often credited with coining in English the word scientist, someone who is the Lord High Sheriff of empiricism and inductiveness in English science of the time. Noted also as both an historian and philosopher of science. Out of the Bridgewater treatise, Darwin quotes Whewell. But with regard to the material world, we can at least go so far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power exerted in each particular case, but the establishment of general laws. That's number one. Number two, Butler. The Butler in question is Joseph Butler. He was Bishop of Durham in the 18th century, authored an analogy between revealed religion, i.e. the Bible, and natural theology. One of the great pieces of 18th century English religious writings, by the way. In his analogy, Butler argues, because by his time everybody agrees with natural theology, that revealed theology is every bit as well established as natural theology. From that book, Darwin takes the following excerpt. The only distinct meaning of the word natural is stated, fixed, settled, since what is natural as much requires and presupposes an intelligent agent to render it so, that is, to effect it continually or at stated times, as what is supernatural or miraculous does to effect it for once. That's from the Bishop of Durham. And then finally, Bacon, Francis Bacon himself, the scientific revolution's outstanding advocate of empiricism in science. Bacon's lasting authority, often conflated with Newton, in English science cannot be underestimated. To be taken seriously as someone doing science in England by Darwin's time, you better say that your science is Baconian science, whether it is or not. Bacon, to conclude, therefore, let no man, out of a weak conceit of sobriety or ill-applied moderation, think or maintain that a man can search too far or to be too well studied in the book of God's Word or in the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy, but rather let men endeavor an endless progress or proficience in both. Darwin is saying to all of his readers, you agree with this stuff? And to a person who would have said, yeah, sure, obviously, of course. This is about as mainstream as it gets. Good. If you agree with that, you're going to like my argument. That's how he says it. Darwin was one of the great rhetoricians of the 19th century. As has been pointed out, The Origin of Species is a great work of science, a great work of literature as well. Darwin, in fact, after this, goes on in The Origin of Species in several other places to speak of the Creator. He has no particular, doesn't have to have any particular quarrel with there being a creator. He appears, in fact, to accept one for original creation. Neither, it should be pointed out, that neither Darwin nor any other scientist at his time had any idea of how all things were created in the first place. But clearly, since things exist, it would seem to be the case that they had to have been created at some point in the past, and therefore logically that there had been some creator. Back up. He discusses God, creation, creator, mentions them, uses those words and various other religious or theological topics over a dozen times in The Origin of Species. In fact, in the first chapter of The Origin of Species, he cites evidence from Genesis quite unproblematically. He takes it as an historical source like any other historical source, something that scientists have been doing for a very long time. Myself, I think, though, the most important place in The Origin of Species where Darwin is, in a sense, invoking an idea of the creator comes in his chapter 5. Most people think that the main arguments have been taken care of in chapters 2, 3, and 4. But I actually think what he does in chapter 5 of The Origin is very, very important. Chapter 5 on the laws of variation. Because it's there that appears, it seems to me, this very interesting being whom we might call Darwin's God. Darwin, in chapter 5 of The Origin, argues as follows. I'm very much paraphrasing him here. I invite you to go and read chapter 5 yourselves. Read Genesis yourselves too, actually. Beneficial. Darwin argues as follows. He says, look, we've got two alternatives. One, species were all independently, separately created. Or they arose through descent with modification, through the mechanism of natural selection. Well, how are we going to decide between those two alternatives? We all Baconian scientists? Darn right we're all Baconian scientists. So as good Baconian scientists, go to the evidence. And he's got lots of evidence. He's got more evidence than anybody else has got. He says, look at the evidence. Study living creatures, and we see in our study of the living world an abundance, a superabundance of evidence of features in living things that are not so much appropriate to their present conditions, but their past history. Well, if all living things were independently created in their current forms, then their creator must inexplicably have built into them evidence of processes that never happened. Well, if God had done that, then one of two things. Either he acts in ways that make it impossible for us to approach him intellectually, to do a rational or lawful science. Or God, in fact, has set out to deceive us. Well, the former of those possibilities would be repugnant to anyone in the natural theology tradition, because you go to nature to find out what God did. Okay? The second would have been outright heresy, that in the Christian conception of God, God isn't Loki or Nana Bush, or he's not a trickster God. That in the Christian tradition, Satan seeks to deceive us, not God. Okay? Therefore, we reject the hypothesis that phony evidence of a non-existent process has been built into the natural record. We accept the other hypothesis that this is in fact a true record of something that actually happened. Okay? It is an awesome display of both logic and rhetoric. And we see later in the origin, Darwin is hammering home his points. He talks, for instance, about equine evolution and discusses some details of equine evolution and asks, well, why would completely separate species, if they had come into existence, Shazam, all had been created with features that appear to result from a common ancestry. Either they actually did have a common ancestor, or this has just been falsely built in to them. And that, he says, makes the works of God a mere mockery and deception. Huh? He could have, but he didn't. I sometimes wonder why he didn't. He could have, if he wanted to, returned to Paley's metaphor of the watch. Because what it seems to be he's saying here in chapter 5 of the Origin is that, okay, let's pick up Paley's watch off the ground, but let's look at it a lot more carefully than Paley ever asked you to look at it. Look at it really carefully. What do we see? We see little tool marks on the little parts of the watch. And we see that the parts have been made in a way that they actually have to be assembled rather than poof, they all sprang into being. Well, if there's evidence, and there is evidence, of this process of constructing the watch, then that's how the watch arose. Through a process, not through Shazam, let there be a watch. Okay? As I say, he goes on elsewhere in the Origin to talk about the Creator. Only in his concluding chapter does he finally feel confident enough to get to really devastating riposte to natural theology. He says, essentially says, all of those marvelous facts of natural theology that was taken as proof for the existence of God, not only can all those facts be explained by natural selection, but so too can various facts that were inconvenient for the natural theology people. Why do geese in upland regions that aren't going to be dabbling around anywhere have webbed feet? Okay? He then backs off a bit and says, truly, that he is not interested in a confrontation with religion. He then says disingenuously, I mean, this is like Casablanca, I'm shocked that anybody would be surprised by this, right? I see no good reason why the views given in this volume should shock the religious feelings of anyone. Why? Of course he knows why. But he says, and again, honestly, he said, this is one of the guys, Charles Kingsley, who was a very, very senior, prominent Anglican minister, as well as being an author of some note. He's one of the guys that got a pre-publication copy of the Origin to read. And Darwin says, a celebrated author and divine, he's talking about this guy, Charles Kingsley, has written to me saying that he has gradually learned to see that it is just as noble a conception of the deity to believe that he created a few original forms capable of self-development into other and needful forms as it is to believe that he required a fresh act of creation to supply the voids caused by the actions of his laws. In other words, there were people who, just as there were people right from the start who had no problem with Copernican astronomy, there were people right from the start, religious people right from the start, who had no problem with Darwinian evolution, who took what we probably now think of sort of, what, liberal Protestant interpretation that, well, if God wanted to achieve his purposes through the secondary causes of natural selection, then that's fine. Darwin, as he gets to the end of the book, his book says this: to my mind, of course, better what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator, the C word, okay? the production and extinction of the past incarnates world due to secondary causes rather than this Shazam stuff. And then, with the key phrase in it, in fact, added in the second edition, you'll find historians who actually should know better, saying that there was no real difference between the first and second edition of the Origin. It's simply not true. In fact, quite, you know, so you're nodding and agreeing with it. Yeah, there are critical differences between the two. In bold is one of those changes there. But second edition comes out almost immediately after the first. And this is basically how Darwin ends his book. This grandeur in this view of life, with several powers I really agreed by the Creator. C word again. Two forms in one. Whilst this planet has gone on cycling according to the fixed law of gravity, he's sort of like invoking Newton. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Thus spake Darwin of God. Was he being hypocritical inasmuch as, by the time he writes this, he himself doesn't believe in God? In part, yes, he was. But the existence of some vague creator God was not, in fact, incompatible with the essence of his argument. What was incompatible, and what Darwin makes clear, is not science. It is invoking of the Creator, and invoking of the Creator as doing some special creative act for which there is a perfectly satisfactory naturalistic explanation. That's not science, something else. Or as Darwin puts it, to evoke special creation in the absence of evidence from nature to support it is to enter into the realms of miracle and to leave those of science. This rather famous illustration of Darwin and the monkey and the mirror is used on the cover of a very, very good book by a former student of mine, Ian Pesketh, of Apes and Ancestors, which is wonderful, wonderful introduction to the immediate debates that happened right after the publication of The Origin. I recommend that book to you. What were the consequences? As I said when I had that slide up about Kingsley, many people were in fact quite unperturbed. That it's not Galileo all over again, it's Copernicus all over again. That most people were quite unperturbed after 1543, when Copernicus published his book. Some did identify what they felt were incompatibilities with religion, and there was that celebrated and also much misunderstood, but Ian Heathcote explains it in his book, clash that occurred between Darwin's chief supporter, Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley, on the one hand, and the Anglican Bishop Wilberforce on the other. The institutional churches wanted no part of a quarrel with religion. This was not going to be Galileo Redux. In fact, Darwin's principal and most nagging Catholic critic, a guy by the name of Mivart, in one of the later editions of The Origin, Darwin has to spend almost an entire chapter dealing with this guy's scientific complaints. Mivart ends up excommunicated. Mivart ends up excommunicated by the Catholic Church. Darwin, at the time of his death, was widely viewed as an ornament to science and to his country, regarded probably as England's greatest scientist since Newton. When he died, obituary notices around the world were just about uniformly and strongly complimentary. At the request of a large numbers of members of Parliament, he gets something that was not much short of a state funeral, and buried in Westminster Abbey. Members of the diplomatic corps, including from Italy, including from the United States, turn out officially for his funeral. Well, that's hardly someone who, in his day, was a symbol of irreligiousness. Okay? That's just not how he was believed, understood at the time. And indeed, during his lifetime, objections to his books and to his ideas on religious grounds weren't really problems for him. It was actually scientific objections to his book. Some who didn't understand very well what he did, some who did understand but did not accept what he said, those who pointed out correctly that, you know, you don't really have much of a mechanism for how various traits are inherited, and that's a problem with what you're saying. That until Mendel's work is rediscovered after the 1900s, nobody's got such a mechanism. Probably, though, the biggest difficulty that Darwin had during his lifetime, and we can trace this through the 6 editions of The Origin, is that scientific estimates of the age of the Earth are being revised downward, downward and downward and downward. The physicists, the geologists are bringing down the estimate of how old the Earth is. That's a problem. Darwin doesn't have to argue with the Tennessee State Board of Educational Examiners. They're not in it, folks. But if Lord Kelvin says, you know, the Earth's not old enough for this to work, this meaning evolution, that's a problem. That he does have to reply to. And it's a very serious problem for Darwin. It's really more in the 20th century, after the so-called neo-Darwinian synthesis becomes the bedrock of biology, with the general growth of secularism and responses to secularism, that Darwin starts to become this hot button kind of guy. And we know about the Scopes trial in Tennessee, though we should probably also know that it was a complete put-up job. That the law was seen as a stupid law right from the beginning. It was expected that the governor of Tennessee, who was renowned as a strong supporter of public education, would veto it. But he's got to think about Bubba and Lorene in the back holler, and they got votes too. So maybe not. And when the case got up to the Tennessee Supreme Court, they basically said, this is stupid. Take it away. We don't ever want to see this again. Obviously, there's the recent emergence of creation science, which I will not talk about. This is completely outside of the scope of my talk today. There are people who will talk to you about that. You had a very good debate about that quite recently. My conclusions here. There's that famous phrase from Nietzsche, right? God is dead and we have killed him. Did Darwin pull the trigger? No, he didn't. His work unquestionably was part of the divorcement of science from religion. His work unquestionably part of the growth of secularism through the 20th century. It was also and remains one of the most profound contributions, scientific contributions, in the history of human thought. I don't think we can do much better than actually Montague's conclusion. Hard to argue. As an empirical statement, it's hard to argue, regardless of how you feel one way or another about Darwin. So I'll end with that, and I'll thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hall. Don't do that very often. I should come to your classes more often. I enjoy that. We have some time for questions. Just before I open that up, I'll just tell you we'll have a quick break, enough for everyone to... The cookies are amazing, and some of them are shaped like little whales. You can have some cookies and run to the bathroom. The women's is as far away from here as you can get. You have to go all the way around the other side. The men's, I have no idea where that is.
It's just over here at the end of the hallway.
Thank you. Never go in there. So we'll have a quick break, but we'll try to start. Yeah, well, it's good not to go in there. So we'll start. if any of you have to leave really early, we can make it tighter. But if we start at 2:45, is that okay for 2:45? 2:45. I know what I'm talking about. As I said, I'm getting over cold. Is that going to be not if that's...
So am I going to take my questions?
We're going to take some questions now. But I want to, if you have some questions for James, I just want to remind you that questions start with a W. Who, what, where. When they don't start with a long story of your past life or the history of a long anecdote, it starts with one of the who, what, where, when, why words. I learned that at TAM. That's the way they start the question period at TAM. Thought that was good. So are there any questions?
Sir.
Why do you think Darwin was never given a knighthood?
See, I didn't know.
The question is why was he never Sir Charles Darwin? Oh yeah, I should stay in front of this camera here. I keep forgetting. I'm a wander around guy. I don't know that he was ever very interested in one. It certainly wasn't that he was in bad odor with the government. That in fact he was in very good odor with the government. When we can tell that in a whole variety of ways. It's possible that it might have been seen as a wee bit controversial to do that. It's also that largely partly doing with his health and partly doing with his own personality. That Darwin hardly ever left his house. That he hardly ever involved himself in public affairs of any sort. So the basis of offering him a knighthood would have been rather rather specific in one way rather than some others. He wasn't someone who was sucking up in the right circles to get a knighthood. Do I have any particular explanation? No. Do I attach to it any very great significance? No, I don't either. That knighthoods weren't handed out like candy the way they are now. A lot of them to go around. And I would again come back to this point that I made that at the end of his life, that he does get officially something just short of a state funeral. So I don't imagine it's because people were afraid to give him a knighthood or it was a symbol of the wrong thing. Yes?
What evidence is there from any of Darwin's private writings, like letters and diaries and stuff, about his religious beliefs or commitment?
Okay, Darwin's own religious beliefs. He was raised in a very conventional, really religious environment. His grandfather had been a bit more of a free thinker, but his grandfather was an Enlightenment figure. His father was a well-to-do country doctor, and went to church and that sort of thing. Read Paley and was extremely impressed with Paley. He said that he could virtually recite Paley from memory. We do know from his letters, from his writings, that he lost his faith, that he stopped believing in God. What is perhaps sometimes misunderstood, and this I think I have to make a very strong point about this, he didn't lose his faith because of his science. So it wasn't that he used to believe in God and the Bible, but he went, sailed off to the Galapagos and he found out that Genesis was wrong and stopped believing in God. That just didn't happen. As best we can trace this out from his private writings, it was the death of his small daughter that created for him a crisis of faith. And he would hardly be alone in the world for saying, oh, I'm faced with what I see as a disconnect between what I've been told about this wonderful and benevolent God and why is this little girl I love just been eliminated.
So when did that happen?
I'm sorry, I think of a date on that for it. It was before the origin we're talking about here. That seemed to be the crisis that way. Did it in fact? Did his subsequent lack of belief in God particularly turned him against religion and its practices? Not particularly. Certainly while his wife was alive, the idea of keeping up appearances seemed to be all right, and donating to religious charities seemed to be okay with him. Various things in his writings, we can see him saying that he considers religion to be one of religious ideas to be one of the things which ennobles human beings, and even though he also wants to try to explain maybe how it evolved, how religious ideas evolved, which he does in his other great book, The Descent of Man. Did he lose his faith in God? Yes, he did. Did he lose his faith in God because of his science? No, I don't think that was the case at all. Yes.
Why did he wait so long to publish his work?
Yeah, it's you have identified the great mystery, the great controversy of Darwin scholarship. That some point, I guess by the end of the 1830s, he's pretty much figured out the idea of this mechanism for evolution. By the mid-1840s, he's actually written out a pretty good discussion of it, which then goes into a desk drawer. And it's only 1859, under the pressure of Alfred Russel Wallace's independent discovery of this mechanism of natural selection, that he publishes. All sorts of ideas have been advanced to try to explain this. He didn't want to offend his wife, or he was afraid he would be laughed at, or something like that. Many scholars, though, have come around to a view of this that roughly goes like this. It's, well, okay, he had a version of his ideas by probably about 1844, and he'd written it out, but like many of us who are academics or scholars, well, not academic, at a university appointment, we write things and then we put them in a drawer, and they stay there as we work on other things, which is what he did. He worked on a lot of other scientific projects, and also he kept building up more and more and more information about what he called the species question for another 15 years. He felt that only when he had something so massively, overwhelmingly convincing that no one could possibly have a single question would he publish. Mercifully, he wasn't allowed to do that, because he would have produced something that would have been unreadable, absolutely unreadable. Thanks to Wallace and the letter. Actually, the letter he sent to Wallace before is kind of funny. That in 1857, he sends this letter to Wallace saying, "Oh, here you're going off to the Malay Peninsula, and if you come across anything interesting, let me know." And then there's this horrible shock a little bit more than a year later when Wallace seems to scoop him. And at that point, that people have been telling me don't keep waiting, don't keep waiting, someone else is going to find this. You know, you're right, someone else has, so I better get it out. So it would seem to be a matter of, he was not, to his satisfaction, ready to present this. By the late 1850s, he was ready. He gets a little nudge, and it comes out. Sorry.
Yeah, you find it kind of ironic that although his book is called On the Origin of Species, which is actually the truncated title, that he doesn't actually give or list any evidence for any common ancestor to any species?
I'm probably going to let the evolutionist here answer that. You want to say something about it, or do you want to say something about that now? Or wait till part 2 when we get to the technicalities?
Well, the answer is he found a ton, right?
Yeah.
He had a ton of evidence.
Yeah.
He had boatloads of it. But why he didn't put it in the title?
Such as, can you give me an example of one example of, in his book, where he lists the common ancestor for any species? And yet that's the title of his book.
You're the Darwin expert.
No. He's, what he is talking about, it's not in fact a treatise in paleontology. So it's not incumbent upon him to do that. It is a treatise about a mechanism, and that's what he talks about at great length in his book.
Elucidating a mechanism by which species can originate, not delineating the ancestry of all species. That's not his point at all.
Well, you'd think he'd have at least one in the book.
That wasn't his area of expertise.
If you're expert in putting words in people's mouths so you can distort them, yes. As you are, sir.
I'm just asking for the evidence.
There's quite a lot of evidence. We'll talk about that in a moment.
Yes. Someone else?
Hey, we're going to-
May I just make one final comment?
Wait, there's one more, please.
You mentioned the C word, creator.
Yes.
As soon as the first edition was sold out, and within a couple of hours, the second edition was in press, the word creator had disappeared in the final sentence, which I personally think is one of the most beautiful sentences in the English language.
He prefers, rather than using God, he does prefer creator. He doesn't prefer creation. To what extent that's there for purely rhetorical purposes, in which case one very much could accuse him of being hypocritical, since he doesn't actually believe in God, is maybe an issue. What I was trying to do today was make a couple of points. Darwin's argument does not hinge on whether the universe was originally created by a supernatural being or not. That doesn't actually affect his argument. As much as the universe is in existence, that it logically had to have come into existence, and so how? A nice shorthand for that might be creation, creator, creative act. Plus, I was arguing that rather than confronting the idea of God, which his readers, almost all of them, would have had in mind, he prefers to say, let me reason along with you, let me invite you to reason along with me, and use, in fact, that shared understanding of how God might or might not act. And in particular, the notion that God would not set out to create false evidence and to deceive.